Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you again today. Really interested to piggyback off of this idea of how denominations are beginning to split. We've watched some videos and read some things about how splitting of denominations. And to piggyback off of that idea, I decided to look at within the African American Baptist community to see how there have been a number of different African American Baptist denominations that have split, and for whatever those reasons. So that's what I did my research on today, and specifically, I'm focusing on the Progressive National Baptist Convention and their split from the National Baptist Convention USA in the early 60s and why they split. And I'm finding out there's three reasons for that. Number one, it's to do with a more of a democratization and less of a hierarchical influence within the denomination. I'm also finding out the idea of social reform changed in the early 60s, and the Progressive National Convention wanted to, or the Progressive National Baptist Convention, PNBC, really wanted to enact social reform, uh, and then also to the role of women, what role of women should play within the church context, the church community. So there was a split because there was more of a growing concern, and again, we see this in the early 60s and 70s, this more of a movement towards a mega church. That Americans are not really necessarily identifying as a particular as a particular denomination, but they're identifying more within the context of the church community. So, as such, the church community, when it comes to what the pastor should be able to preach on, what the church should be able to emphasize, the allocation of funds, that should be more democratized. That should be more of an emphasis on the local church rather than the denomination church. So, the PNBC really focused on that movement, and that caused a split that way. And also, in addition to this, one of the main focuses on that was the idea of civil rights. Again, being the early 60s, the National Baptist Convention was more conservative with the idea of social reform. It's not that they didn't support Martin Luther King and his efforts, but they did not like the idea of social disobedience and or civil disobedience rather. And the PNBC really leaned in on the idea of enacting social reform. They really leaned into this idea of black power and black solidarity, and the church was supposed to be a vessel for obtaining racial equality and integration, and they were more aggressive on that end. And also too, they're more aggressive on women in their involvement in ministry. There was immediately as the convention, this new convention began after the split that happened, the PNBC allowed for women to be to hold office within the congregation, and for women to be able to preach and to be able to have their own churches, and it was sanctioned by the denomination. In addition to that, there was a whole women's auxiliary that was formed underneath where people could just donate funds directly to the women's auxiliary rather than funneling it through the denomination down into the particular women's group. And the women's group focused on missions, focused on building churches, and also too, in their own backyard they printed what they felt like was needed in the African American community was more of a focus on and more information on women's health. And because there's a lot of misinformation that was going on, so the church published and wrote works specifically designed to help African American women to take charge of their own health in the 60s and 70s, and it continues still to this day. And so these are some of the reasons why that I feel like the national progressive national convention shifted, was more of idea to help influence government to make social reform when the NBC was a little bit more hesitant on that. And also too, just leaning into the idea of civil rights and more of a democratization. Like I said earlier, I think that a big movement for this is the I in my research, I found it's more of a movement of people not being concerned with whether you're a Baptist, but I identify as a member of this particular local church. So love to be able to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks so much for watching.